Welcome into the quick crash course on the Catalan Opening. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and within this short video, you're gonna learn all the main variations, plans, and ideas of this opening. It starts off similar to the Queen's Gambit, but then you deviate by fianchettoing your kingside bishop. And first off, it makes your future castling rock solid, and there will be no attacks against your king in any near future. Secondly, by putting your bishop right here to g2, it starts putting this long-term pressure to your opponent's center and queenside, making it very annoying and uncomfortable for them. While your light-squared bishop is very active, his black brother is rather struggling. It got completely stuck back there, can't get out, and that is the reason why you don't want to trade these pawns in the middle of the board, as that would open up a diagonal for that bishop. However, very often in this position, your opponents will play by analogy with the Queen's Gambit, and they'll play pawn b6 aiming to fianchetto the bishop. And while it's perfectly fine to do that in the Queen's Gambit, in the Catalan, it actually does not work for black, and usually they're going to go down from here, and I'll show you why. So first off, you want to trade this pawn in the middle of the board. What? You may be wondering, hey, wait a second, Igor, just a second ago you told that we do not want to trade here because that would open up this diagonal. Yes, but the situation changed once he played that move pawn b6. Black no longer wants to develop the bishop somewhere here, because in that case, all these weaknesses on the queen side will become a real problem for them. Therefore, they will actually fianchetto the bishop right here. But now the issue for black is the bishop still is stuck behind their own pawn, and therefore is totally dull. It can't do anything, cannot attack you in any way. And that is why it is so good for you to trade in the center, to make this pawn fixated so that he can't ever trade it off and open a diagonal for his bishop. By the way, even though we're going to go over different variations, I do not want you to try to memorize them, right? I want you to understand these ideas. And it's actually a misconception that strong players memorized all the opening lines. You know, as a grandmaster, sometimes I'm taking a shower and I'm thinking, wait, did I already shampoo my hair? So it's not that my memory is so brilliant and I just capture everything. But I hope that by understanding these variations, and ideas and plans, that will make it natural for you to play correctly. All right, so what are you going to do next? Now, there is a standard way, but for this particular case, there is also a better way. I'll show you both. So the standard way is just developed. So you play bishop f4, putting this bishop to an open diagonal. Then you also add your rook, which will add potentially more pressure. Then you start jumping forward with your knights, creating threats. And all that stuff is very annoying for black. And that is already good enough for you. In most cases, black is going to suffer here a lot. However, in this particular position, there is a move which I like even more. It's the move knight to e5. Because after that, it's extremely tricky for black to stay in the game. And all their natural moves are going to go down so badly that it makes this move so good. Now, first off, we're putting pressure down here. And also, you open up this diagonal for your bishop, which also starts putting more pressure. And that is how it already feels a bit annoying. And any little inaccuracy will just get black out of the game right out of the gate. For example, if they play c5, the move which is very standard for all Queen's Gambit type of positions, in this position it is wrong, because once you trade off, it helps you to put direct pressure to his center, and it usually collapses pretty fast. For example, black recaptures, these pawns kind of look a little bit good on the surface, but in reality they're weak. They are already under massive pressure, and by playing queen b3, you totally overload black. From here, you attack the bishop, you maintain pressure to the central pawn on d5, you're also ready to bring your rook, additionally, to put even more pressure, and you can see by the sheer volume of my arrows that black is in trouble. They usually play queen b6, but other moves can't help either. But after that, we aren't going to trade queens, instead you simply snatch this pawn in the middle of the board, and now you're already a pawn up. Now, a little trick is, if they capture the queen right here, it's going to be a blunder, because then you're going to take this bishop and in between move while checking the king, and that's how you're going to win material. So you play this in between check, you capture a bishop, and only then you will capture the queen. You'll end up with that extra bishop that you capture right there on e7. So let's take that back. If instead black tries trading off everything in the middle of the board, it also doesn't make their life easier, because right now this rook in the corner is attacked. What can they do about this? They also cannot develop their knight because of your excellent centralized knight, which does control these both squares. Therefore, they end up playing knight a6 so that their rook is developed or defended at least that way. But now you've got one more unpleasant surprise. This time you drop this f-pawn. And that's a nice tactical motif. They cannot take the knight because that would still leave that rook in the corner undefended. So what can they do instead? Quite often they'll play knight b4, trying to kick away this queen and then hoping to snatch your knight. But now you've got one of those classical tactical motifs which you've probably seen in tactical puzzles, but it's rare to execute it in real life. But now you can make it happen. It's a double check, the king needs to move, then you sack your queen right here, and you finish the game with the smart little checkmate. It's pretty cool that in the Catalan, a lot of natural moves of your opponent are wrong, such as developing their queenside knight. In this case, you can play queen a4, put more pressure, and there's already no easy way at all for black to get out of this. Now, you're putting pressure to this knight on d7 as well as this pawn on d5, but if black tries to trade off on e5, then their other knight got hit by a pawn, and where can it go? Some of your opponents, those who came from Blunderville, may wish to move it here, right here, but then you can snatch it with a queen. If they try to move it to the middle of the board, then it's also a miscalculation because you've got a lot of attackers, 3 in particular, and you're going to win a pawn right there. If they move the knight backwards, then you can still win this pawn in the middle of the board with a great position. Moreover, sometimes your opponents will try to fight back and get their pawn back with knight takes e5, and while usually you eat an elephant one bite at a time, in this case, this one bite is all you need. You grab a bishop and you win. By the way, they asked me to clarify, the Catalan Opening has very little, if anything, to do with the Spanish Opening. And rumor has it, the Catalan Opening might soon get closed for foreigners, so use it while you still can. It's also worth mentioning that you can get to the Catalan position via a different move order, and sometimes it allows you to avoid certain openings that you don't want to play. For example, if you go d4, knight f6, c4, and pawn e6, then you can see that your opponent does not want to play the Queen's Gambit. Probably they're going to play the Nimzo Indian defense or the Queen's Indian defense. And in that case, instead of playing knight f3, which would allow them this Nimzo Indian, you can play g3 straight away. And now they're kind of running out of options. Bishop b4 pin makes no sense anymore because there is no knight on c3, therefore there is no pin. And if they try b6, then it doesn't work because you take control of this diagonal first, and they can nothing counter the bishop. It would simply be a blunder, and therefore their plan failed. Here's another use case. If you want to avoid some aggressive openings of black, such as Benko Gambit or Benoni defense, then you can use another move order. You may avoid playing d4 for a few moves and instead start with a knight development or pawn development, and that way you avoid your opponent hitting your central pawn on d4 with c5 because there is no pawn right there, and that will often force your opponent to transition to the usual variations, and then you can get it back to the Catalan position. From here, fundamentally, black has a choice between two systems. Either they can accept this pawn on c4 at some point, which would lead to an open Catalan positions, or they may choose for the closed system with pawn to c6, which is more defensive, solid, but a bit more passive for black. We'll talk about them both. Let's start from the closed Catalan, where they play pawn c6. Now, their bishop on c8 is really sad about this choice, and it can't get out completely anyhow. However, they are hoping for their solid position they hope to develop gradually. Now you can play queen c2, simply defending this pawn on c4 so that your opponent cannot just win it. And on the next move you still need to be careful, because development of your knight right here would block the defense and would allow them to snatch the pawn. That's why you need to develop your knight to d2. From here, it reinforces this pawn on c4, but even more importantly, we're getting ready to break open the center with the move pawn e4. Now your pawn will probably play b6, still trying to develop his bishop. Now you play e4, and now you seize the initiative. From here, if black does nothing, this pawn is ready to go forward and to chase away this knight, which will have to come back, and it's annoying for black. However, if black captures this pawn on e4, then now your plan just works out perfectly well. Now you totally dominate in the middle of the board, you control everything, your opponent has no pawns, this knight in the center is strong, this diagonal is open for your bishop, and you're already taking over. Your opponent here will usually play a bishop to b7, still hoping for this move pawn to c5, and we need to be very careful, because we know that this bishop was expected to rock and roll, but it ate too much McDonald's and now only moves one square at a time. We want to keep it that way. Therefore, we definitely do not want this pawn to come forward. From here, the bishop will become extremely active. It will start hitting our knight right here on e4, and we want to prevent this. So how do you do that? First off, you can trade off this knight from e4 so that it no longer is a target. And after that, black is still ready to play c5, there are a couple ways to cope with that. One of them is rook d1, opposing your rook to the queen so that it's not easy for black to open the d file. And if they try to move the queen out of the way, then it's a tactical mistake. It allows you to develop your bishop with a tempo while hitting the queen. They'll usually try to cover, but after the trade, now you can utilize the second idea that prevents black from pushing the pawn forward to c5. You just play that move yourself. And in this case, you also gain one more tempo hitting the same queen. This completely barricades the bishop, and trade on c5 is only good for you. You're gonna attack the queen and open up this file for your rook. That's cool. If they don't take but simply retreat back, then it's also great. Knight e5, once again that great move which puts your knight to an active position and opens up this diagonal for a bishop. You start putting pressure to this pawn on c6. For example, on the next turn, you can also bring the other rook and reinforce the pressure. This bishop is totally dull. You're attacking. All your pieces are very active. Potentially, you can relocate the knight to d6 if you want to, and you already have a positionally won game. By the way, if you want to improve your positional chess, I've got a free masterclass about that. You can click the link below the video in the description and get to know all the main concepts that you need to get yourself to the next level. Some of your opponents will try to develop their dark squared bishop to a more active square, and in this case we have another system to punish that. Initially we simply castle, and then we don't worry about this pawn. You go knight c3, we have a specific plan in mind which is going to target this bishop and actually take advantage of it. Now here, we don't worry about this pawn, because if they try to win it, it does not work. We've got this interesting move knight to d2, retreating the knight, aiming to get the pawn back, and from there the knight is going to hit the bishop. Also, your central pawns are ready to roll. But if your opponent tries to hold on to this extra pawn, then this idea fails because of this little but nice tactics. You grab a pawn and he can't recapture because of the pin. It's, as always, our sniper bishop that is putting the pressure and is doing this important work. From b5, you're going to take the bishop, then you're going to pick up the other pawn, and your position is great. Since your opponent can't win your pawn, he has to settle for a more modest move, but now you have a really paradoxical maneuver, knight retreat back to d2. At first it looks like an awkward move, you're moving the same knight twice in an opening, you're blocking your other pieces, what the heck are you doing here? But the idea is mainly you're getting ready to break open the center with the move pawn e4, and for this purpose your knight stands really well. Plus, you still protect this pawn on c4, just in case. And the idea here is, after any move of your opponent, rook e8 or b6, whatever, you're going to strike in the center with e4 and put pressure. Now, as your opponent recaptures, which is wrong, but they usually will, and you take on e4, this is the moment where you can be confident that you outsmarted your opponent. It's once again all these sort of classical advantages. You have strong center, you opened up this bishop is also active, and black has nothing to show for. So here knight e4 attacks the bishop. Let's say he trades, that doesn't change anything. As promised, we're taking advantage of this bishop. He was hoping that it takes a more active position, but we use it as a liability for black. Now the bishop will need to retreat somewhere. If it goes back this way, then it's just passive. You can simply continue your development, and again, you have total domination, center and everything. You're going to play queen c2, put your rooks right here, and life's good. If instead the bishop retreats to c7, then you can develop your bishop actively here because of his bishop, but you can take it one square forward and take advantage of this attack. Now your opponent will probably have to play this, but it weakens his king and his kingside position. He can retreat back, but now, besides very passive position, he also has a bunch of weaknesses right here. And if he tries to open up the position and somehow untangle these pieces after the exchange, we're not going to be so nice. We know that to take is a mistake. That's why instead you're going to put the pawn forward and put more pressure onto your opponent. The pawn is ready to go forward and to attack this bishop, and if he captures, recapturing with the pawn and pushing him forward is good, but here queen takes d5 is probably even stronger because you do it with a tempo, with a check, and once the king moves, now you have an absolutely dominant position. You take the open file, your both bishops are very active, your knight is excellently placed, ready to jump forward, and again, it's a strategically winning position. If your opponent is well prepared or simply greedy, he may grab this pawn on c4, and now you play queen c2 aiming to get it back. Your opponent cannot hold on to this pawn, as b5 would weaken this diagonal, which may be a problem, but first off you just play a4 to undermine this pawn chain. Now what can he do? He certainly does not want to split up all his pawns, as that would make it clear that he skipped the class on pawn structures. And otherwise, a6 fails, as always, in the queen's gambit due to this capture, and then they cannot take back because of the pin. Otherwise, if they try to defend this pawn this way, then it also fails, but after a clever way. So here you need to trade and now play an important move, knight to g5. This opens up this attack to the rook. As always, our Catalan bishop strikes. The only move for black to cover the diagonal would be the move knight to d5. And while it does get the job done, it contains a little but important tactical flaw. Queen takes h7 is mating 1, and that is why you needed the knight to be right there on g5. This means your opponent cannot hold on to this extra pawn, he'll have to wipe his tears and play pawn a6. They're counting on you capturing this pawn, and then they wish to play this move pawn b5, which is pretty good for them. Normally, in general, not in this position, playing b5 is a bad idea because you can make use of the weakened diagonal and start attacking right away. But in this position, you don't have time to do that because you need to move the queen away from this danger first. And as you do that, now you're ready to play knight a5 and start attacking, but black is right on time to put their own bishop on this diagonal, and they equalized. You can shut it down by going a4 yourself and preventing the move pawn b5. Now this bishop is depressed again. He prays for a better future and crawls to d7. You get back this pawn and you're ready to rock and roll. You want to just develop, grab the center, develop the bishop, and have all these great positional advantages. Therefore, your opponent really needs to prevent this somehow. There is a tricky move b5 that you need to be aware of. At first it looks bad, and it is, but if you play this natural capture, then it's a big blunder, and it's exactly what your opponent is hoping for. After he recaptures, now both your queen and your rook are under the attack and you're going to lose one of them. Instead, simply retreat back to c2 and your opponent will be left with all these weaknesses. The main move by black here is to finally bring the bishop to this diagonal. They could not fianchetto the bishop, but they found a workaround. From here, the bishop also controls the square e4, making it harder for you to push the pawn there and to grab the center. In fact, he's got two pieces that control this pawn e4, the square e4, and therefore you don't mind going bishop g5 and even trading off one of them so that it's easier for you to grab the center later. Let's say he goes knight d7 and now knight to c3. Both of you completed development, but you have a little more space and you have this pawn in the middle of the board. Therefore, black still needs to be careful and they still need to find a way to equalize. They'll usually play something like h6, but as we discussed before, it's okay for you to trade off this knight on f6. However, they now have a spare knight to still control this square. They have two pieces that control it, therefore you need one more to prepare this advancement. And now once again black is somewhat in trouble. If they do nothing, you push the pawn forward, you'll be totally dominant after that, then you can play e4, knight e5, and you start pressing. If they go knight e4, trying to mechanically block the advancement, then you can retreat the queen, provide more attack, and after this capture, again the position, like in all these variations, objectively speaking the position is about equal. But in reality, playing it as white is much easier. You play pretty obvious moves, you have these ideas to grab the center, put the knight forward, maybe put a rook right here. It all makes sense and it's all pretty simple. But your opponent needs to be super precise and any wrong move and he immediately falls off the cliff. That is why the fact that Stockfish tells you that it's equal is a bit deceptive. It is indeed equal, but it's much easier to play it as white than as black. For example, here, if he tries to blockade one of these pawn moves, that might be a big mistake. For instance, the move pawn to b5 looks good as it prevents, potentially this move c4 by you. However, now you've got this nice little tactical shot, threatening mate, and that way allows you to trade off this bishop on c6 with a double attack. And on the next turn, he'll have to move the rook, but will lose this pawn on b5, and that way you'll get an advantage. Sometimes your opponents are going to check your king here. And after that, you simply cover, and then beginners will trade off bishops, which doesn't bring anything good for black and simply allows you to develop your knight with a tempo, and after that you will continue as usual, play queen c2, e4, life's good. However, when you face more advanced players, they will sometimes retreat the bishop back. And then there is an interesting question, so why did they play bishop b4 first to then retreat back to e7? Well, they're trying to justify the idea that this bishop on d2 is awkward and blocks out your knight and queen. But in reality, of course, it is such a nuanced thing, it's not going to change things much at all, and you will simply move the bishop forward down the line, and it will transpose it into pretty much usual Catalan positions. Moreover, occasionally you can make use of this bishop on d2 right here. For example, if he tries to snatch the pawn, then after queen c2 there is a very sudden trap here for black. If they try to play natural moves, b5, holding on to this pawn, you undermine, they defend. Then after the trade, there is a new and sudden tactical thing that you can use, bishop a5. You didn't have that move before for lack of bishop right there, but now you hit the queen and all of a sudden you win the game. The queen needs to move and black needs to be careful, because after the queen moves, you continue with knight to e5, controlling more squares and hitting the rook in the corner. The only way to defend the rook would be for them to use the knight on d5, but now knight c3 adds even more pressure, attacks this knight, and also attacks the pawn on b5. And as they try to defend it, after knight e4, suddenly the queen is trapped right in the middle of the board, and your bishop from a5 is doing a good job. Besides that, there is an interesting positional trap, or rather a plan that you can use against an unsuspecting opponent. This is a game of Magnus Carlsen, and he loves using this plan. People usually freak out. They think, oh, he's genius. He has this increased intake of magnesium and calcium. But no, it's just a plan, and you can use it as well. So here's the thing. Here it was black to play. As always, black is struggling with development of his last square bishop. He played e5, and Carlsen goes rook d1, bishop g4, h3. So far, nothing special. But here's an interesting moment. White starts trading off pieces. First, he trades off rooks. Then he offers an exchange off the other rook. After bishop g6, he keeps trading. And it looks like white does not know what to do, or maybe he's trying to play for a draw. But there is a caveat. So here's the thing. After an exchange, at some point, black figures out that despite pieces being traded off, their problems remain. Because here's the deal. Even in an endgame, your light square bishop is still powerful. It puts pressure to your opponent's queen side. This knight can never walk away, or else the pawn on b7 will be lost. The pawn cannot move, because then the knight will be lost. And if black does nothing at all, then you'll just keep adding more pressure. You can jump with your knight forward to c4 and start attacking this pawn or that pawn. Your bishop also puts pressure, the other bishop puts pressure, and that is how you often manage to win, even in an endgame which looks equal at first. But the problem for black is this light square bishop is very active, and often these advanced pawns of black like defenders. Once you traded off some pieces, those pieces no longer defend these advanced pawns, and that is how they become easy targets for you. And Carlsen, in fact, did just that in this game. He played, oops, I'm sorry, just switched over somewhere. Okay, we're back on track. So here, Carlsen just played knight c4, increased the pressure, grabbed one of these pawns, and then started promoting his extra pawns on the queen side and won the game. So that is how you can use the same plan just as well. If you want to learn to play and understand such positions better, feel free to go to my free masterclass up there. And if you want to get my middle game guide, check out this video right there.